It's March 19th, 1840, in San Antonio, Texas. 65 Comanche leaders walk into a council house expecting peace talks. They bring a single captive, Matilda Lockhart, a 16-year-old girl, her face scarred, nose burned off from months of torture. The Texans demand all captives back. The Comanche say no, explaining other bands hold the rest. Suddenly, the room explodes, knives flash, pistols fire, tomahawks swing. In minutes, 35 Comanche lie dead, including women and children, while 7 Texans fall. This wasn't negotiation. It was a trap that ignited a war. Over the next few months, the Comanche burned entire towns to ashes, proving one thing. They weren't just fighters. They were a storm no one could outrun. How did tribes like them rise to dominate empires? And what finally stopped them? For centuries, the Great Plains and Southwest belonged to warrior tribes who ruled with unmatched power: the Comanche, the Sioux, and the Apache. These weren't just groups of people. They were forces of nature, legends etched into the land. The Comanche struck like lightning on horseback, their speed and ferocity unrivaled. The Sioux made history by crushing General Custer and his 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn, a victory that still resonates. The Apache, masters of guerrilla warfare, moved through mountains and deserts like shadows, impossible to track, impossible to stop. These tribes didn't just fight, they dominated. Empires feared them. Spain, with all its colonial strength, couldn't break them. Mexico tried and paid in blood. The United States, even with its growing armies and resources, learned the hard way. These warriors didn't kneel. Settlers pushing west called them ruthless, and they could be, but that wasn't the whole story. They had to be tough because their world, the open plains, the bison herds, their freedom, was being stolen. History might tag them as barriers to civilization, but that's too narrow. They were survivors, tacticians, the last defenders of a life that refused to yield. So how did they rise? What made them unstoppable for so long? And what finally brought them down? My name's Sam, and this is Wild America. Let's start with the Comanche, the storm you couldn't escape. The Comanche ruled the southern Great Plains for nearly 2 centuries, from the late 1600s to the 1870s. They were a terror to settlers, soldiers, and rival tribes alike. By the early 1700s, they'd driven the Apache off the plains, claiming a vast territory from Texas to Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma, 24,000 square miles called Comancheria. No one controlled it but them. It was their empire, built on raw power. Their edge? The horse. Originally part of the Shoshone in Wyoming, they moved south in the late 1600s to hunt bison. When they got Spanish horses, their world changed. They rode at 30 or 40 miles an hour, firing arrows with deadly precision, vanishing across the prairie like ghosts. They hit settlements, took horses and captives, and were gone before anyone could react. Trade routes like the Santa Fe Trail became battlegrounds. They stole 40,000 horses from Mexico and Texas over the years. That's the scale they worked on. They didn't do alliances, no real friends, just trading partners, like the Comancheros in New Mexico, swapping horses, weapons, and captives, while everyone else was either an enemy or a target. They raided Texas without mercy, clashed with tribes like the Ute, Pawnee, and Osage, and used brute force to hold their ground. Spain and the U.S. tried to turn these rivalries against them, but the Comanche were too wild, too unpredictable to pin down. Under a full moon, the Comanche moon, they'd ride 600 or 700 miles into Mexico, hitting places like Durango and Zacatecas. Settlements burned, hundreds of horses were taken, dozens of captives seized, and they'd disappear into the night. War was their core. Every raid, every battle, every captive, 2,000 to 3,000 over their reign, built their strength. It wasn't random cruelty, it was a code. Strength ruled the plains, and they made sure everyone knew it. Women and children they took, like Cynthia Ann Parker in 1836, often became Comanche, some staying by choice. Male warriors were trophies. The weak died in agony. The strong earned respect, though rarely mercy. Brutal, yes. Effective, absolutely. Their name alone kept enemies away. Enter Comancheria, and you might not leave. That's the Comanche at their height, a whirlwind of power and fear. But it couldn't last. Settlers poured in, tens of thousands, from the 1830s to 1860s. Disease struck. Smallpox in 1837 and 1838 killed nearly half of them. Then came the armies, relentless and heavily armed. The story shifts there, but for now, see them as they were. Riders on the horizon, untouchable, unstoppable until the world closed in. For nearly 200 years, from 1680 to 1875, the Comanche ruled the southern Great Plains, a force so fierce they left settlers, soldiers, and rival tribes trembling. They weren't just survivors, they were a whirlwind, tearing through anyone who dared cross their path. By the early 18th century, between 1700 and 1720, they'd already pushed the Apache off the plains, taking over a massive stretch of land from Texas up to Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. This was Comancheria, 24,000 square miles of untamed territory, and no one else called the shots. They built an empire out of sheer will and power. It all started back in the late 17th century, around 1690 to 1700, when they were still part of the Shoshone up in Wyoming. Hunger drove them south, first for bison, then for something even better, horses. They snatched them from the Spanish, and that's when everything clicked. On horseback, they became unstoppable, masters of warfare, riding at 30 or 40 miles an hour, firing arrows with pinpoint accuracy while moving full speed. They'd hit a target and vanish into the prairie like ghosts, leaving nothing but dust and chaos behind. Trade routes, like the Santa Fe Trail, turned into their personal battlegrounds. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, they stole 4,000 horses from Mexico and Texas, a number so big it's hard to wrap your head around. The Comanche didn't play nice with others. They had no real friends, just trading partners like the Comancheros in New Mexico, who dealt with them in horses, weapons, and captives from 1780 to 1850. Everyone else, enemies or targets. They raided Texas relentlessly, clashed with tribes like the Ute, Pawnee, and Osage, and used brute force to keep their dominance. Spain and later the U.S. tried to stir up these rivalries, hoping to weaken them, but the Comanche were too slippery, too unpredictable to control. When the full moon lit up the sky, what they called the Comanche moon, they'd ride deep into Mexico. In the 1840s, they struck places like Durango and Zacatecas, 600 or 700 miles from the U.S. border, grabbing hundreds of horses and dozens of captives, burning settlements to the ground before anyone could catch them. War wasn't just something they did, it was who they were. Every raid, every battle, every captive they took, around 2,000 to 3,000 from 1800 to 1875, built their power. Women and kids they captured, like Cynthia Ann Parker in 1836, often got adopted into the tribe, raised as Comanche, some even choosing to stay. Male warriors, though, were different. They were trophies. The weak ones died, usually in pain. The strong earned a nod of respect, but mercy was rare. This wasn't cruelty for fun. It was a code, old as the plains itself. Strength ruled, and violence was their way of keeping everyone else at bay. The scarier they got, the fewer dared to challenge them. But that power couldn't hold forever. Settlers kept coming, tens of thousands between 1830 and 1860, overwhelming the land. Disease hit hard. Smallpox in 1837 and 1838 wiped out nearly half their people. Then the military campaigns rolled in. On March 19, 1840, in San Antonio, Texas, set a trap at the Council House fight. They invited 65 Comanche, including 33 chiefs, to talk peace, but it went south fast over a captive dispute. 35 Comanche died, and that lit a fuse. Buffalo Hump led the Great Raid in August 1840, burning Victoria and Linville, killing 20 or 30 settlers, and taking 3,000 horses as revenge. By May 15, 1858, the Texas Rangers, led by Captain John Rip Ford with 100 men, turned the tables. They ambushed a Comanche village at Little Robe Creek in Oklahoma, killing 76 with Colt revolvers that outgunned their bows. The tide was shifting. On October 21, 1867, the Treaty of Medicine Lodge forced them onto a 3-million-acre reservation in Oklahoma, stripping away their land. Buffalo hunters slaughtered 30 million bison from 1865 to 1874, leaving them starving. Then on June 27, 1874, Issatai led 250 warriors in a desperate attack on adobe walls, but it failed. The Red River War in September 1874 sealed it. The U.S. Army hit Palo Duro Canyon, destroying 1,400 horses and their supplies. On June 2nd, 1875, Quanah Parker surrendered. The Comanche, once lords of the plains, were done. Their reign was over, but their legend? That's still alive. The Sioux rose from humble roots in Minnesota's forests, part of an ancient group called the Black Duck Cathiaclam River culture. By 1300, they'd come together as the Seven Council Fires, or Otidi-Sakowin, a tight-knit alliance that laid the groundwork for their future power. Fast forward to the 17th century, between 1600 and 1650, and things got messy. The Dakota, living near the Great Lakes, got shoved west by the Iroquois, who'd gotten their hands on Dutch guns and weren't shy about using them. That push sent the Lakota out onto the plains by 1680 to 1700, where they found Spanish horses and turned them into a game changer. They didn't just ride, they became cavalry warriors, fast, fierce, and deadly. Back east, the Dakota teamed up with the French from 1650 to 1700, trading for guns to hold their own. But that alliance didn't stop trouble. In the 1720s, war broke out with the Ojibwe, and by 1736, the Sioux showed their teeth, wiping out 21 of Jean-Baptiste de la Vérendrye's men in Minnesota. They weren't playing around. By 1803, the Sioux had split into three branches: the Eastern Dakota, or Santee, the Western Dakota, or Yankton, and the Lakota, or Teton. Together, they numbered 25,000 to 3,000 strong, a force ready to take on the world. By the mid-19th century, from 1850 to 1870, the Lakota owned the northern plains, stretching from Dakota to Montana, across 2,000 square miles. They were kings up there, and two battles proved it. First, the Fetterman Fight on December 21st, 1866, in Wyoming. Crazy Horse set the trap, luring Captain William Fetterman and his 81 soldiers out from Fort Phil Kearny. Fetterman thought he could handle it, but he walked right into an ambush. Between 1,000 and 2,000 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors swarmed them, wiping out every last man in 30 minutes. It was a brutal lesson. Don't underestimate the Sioux. Then came the big one, Little Bighorn, June 25th to 26th, 1876, in Montana. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led 2,500 to 3,000 warriors against Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 210 men from the 7th Cavalry. Custer figured he'd roll over a small band, but he was dead wrong. The Sioux hit like a storm, and in 2 hours, 268 U.S. soldiers were gone, Custer included. It was a crushing win, the kind that makes history books. But it didn't last. The U.S. wasn't about to let it slide. From 1876 to 1877, they sent 100,000 troops to hunt the Sioux down, turning victory into a desperate fight for survival. The real blow came later. On February 8, 1887, the Dawes Act slashed Sioux land from 134 million acres to just 15 million, forcing them into a foreign way of life. They didn't just lose land, they lost freedom. In 1889, Congress carved up their reservation into 5 smaller chunks, stripping away another 9 million acres. Protests didn't matter, the land was gone. By 1920, they'd lost 90% of what they once had. Hundreds of thousands of acres swallowed up. Their culture got hit just as hard. The Dawes Act banned their traditions, and from 1880 to 1930, 2,000 Sioux kids were forced into boarding schools, ripped from their families to have their heritage erased. The Sioux were kings of the North, warriors who took down empires and held their ground against impossible odds. They started in Minnesota's woods, adapted to the plains, and mastered the horse to dominate. Battles like Fetterman and Little Bighorn showed their brilliance, their courage. But the U.S. kept coming. Troops, laws, broken promises, and wore them down. Their land shrank, their ways were outlawed, and their kids were taken. Still, even after all that, the Sioux spirit didn't break. They fought to the end, and that's what makes them legends. The Apache weren't one single tribe, but a collection of nomadic groups, like the Chiricahua and Mescalero roaming across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and into Mexico. In the 19th century, their numbers hovered between 8,000 and 1,000. Small but mighty. Spain first ran into them in 1541, noting how they hunted bison, lived in skin tents, hauled their gear with dogs, and even drank animal blood to keep going. They were tough, built for survival in a harsh land, and they didn't sit still. That mobility made them ghosts of the Southwest, always on the move, always ready to strike. From the 17th to 18th centuries, between 1600 and 1750, they had a rocky relationship with Spanish settlers. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they raided, keeping everyone on edge. By 1786, Mexico had had enough of their attacks and put a bounty on them, 100 pesos per Apache scalp. That turned ugly fast. In 1837, Apache leader Juan Jose Compa got killed for the cash, and that lit a fire under Mangas, Coloradas. He hit back hard, tearing through northern Mexico, killing hundreds, sending a clear message. The Apache weren't prey, they were predators. His retaliation wasn't just revenge. It was a warning to anyone thinking they could hunt his people. Things shifted after the Mexican-American War in 1848, when the U.S. took over 2 million square miles of Apache land without blinking. The Apache didn't take it lying down. From 1849 to 1886, they fought back with raids that kept settlers and soldiers scrambling. They struck fast, hit supply lines, ambushed patrols, then melted into the desert or mountains. One big clash came on July 14 to 15, 1862, at Apache Pass in Arizona. Mangas, Coloradas, and Cochise led 200 warriors against 120 U.S. soldiers over a key water source. The Apache knew the terrain, but the Army had mountain howitzers, cannons that pounded their positions. 10 to 15 Apache fell, and they had to pull back. It was a rare retreat, but it didn't break them. Then there's Geronimo. Born Goyocla, he turned into a legend after Mexican soldiers slaughtered his family in 1851. From then until 1886, he led raids across Mexico and the U.S., driven by rage and a need to fight back. His attacks left hundreds dead, and in 1856, Durango alone reported 6,000 deaths from Apache and Comanche raids combined. Geronimo didn't lead big armies, just small bands, but he made them count. He'd hit hard, vanish into the wilderness, and leave entire regiments chasing shadows. The U.S. threw everything at him, and still he kept going, a one-man war machine fueled by loss. But even legends run out of room. On September 4, 1886, Geronimo surrendered at Skeleton Canyon in Arizona. He had just 38 people with him, including 16 warriors, facing down 5,000 U.S. troops. Outnumbered, outgunned, he finally laid down his arms. The Army shipped him and his group off to Florida, then Oklahoma, locking them up as prisoners of war. It wasn't just him either. In December 1875, 1,500 Yavapai and Tonto Apache got forced out of Camp Verde on a brutal 180-mile march through freezing rivers and rugged land. Between 300 and 400 died along the way, and the survivors were stuck at San Carlos until 1900, caged on a reservation while settlers took their homes. The Apache were ghosts, warriors who lived free and fought like the land itself. Swift, unforgiving, impossible to pin down. They took on Spain, Mexico, and the U.S., holding their own for centuries. Mangas, Coloradas, and Geronimo turned their names into symbols of resistance, striking fear into anyone who crossed them. But in the end, it wasn't just bullets that stopped them. It was numbers, exhaustion, and a world that wouldn't stop closing in. Their fight ended, but their story? That's still echoing through the Southwest. The Comanche, Sioux, and Apache left marks on history that can't be erased. The Comanche ruled the plains with a grip so tight, it felt like the land itself bent to their will. A whirlwind of power that swept across the South. The Sioux shattered empires, taking down giants like Custer and proving they could outsmart and outfight anyone who dared challenge them up north. The Apache, meanwhile, never yielded, slipping through the Southwest like ghosts, defying every army sent their way with a stubbornness that was almost supernatural. These weren't just tribes. They were forces that shaped a wild America. But the war they fought couldn't last forever. Guns gave their enemies an edge they couldn't match forever, cutting through their numbers with cold efficiency. Disease swept in like a silent killer, wiping out families and whole communities, faster than any battle could. And then there were the settlers, millions of them pouring in from 1800 to 1900, a flood of people that drowned their way of life under sheer weight of numbers. The Comanche got boxed onto reservations, their horses and bison gone. The Sioux saw their lands carved up and their culture outlawed, fighting to the bitter end. The Apache held out longest, but even they couldn't outrun exhaustion and overwhelming odds. The tools of war, sickness, and endless waves of newcomers won out. Yet here's the thing, their spirit didn't die. The Comanche's fierce independence still echoes in the stories of the plains. The Sioux' victories at places like Little Bighorn remain a testament to their brilliance and courage, a reminder of what they could do. The Apache's defiance, embodied in names like Geronimo, lives on as a symbol of resistance that never broke, even when the odds were impossible. They lost the land, the battles, the freedom they'd known, but they didn't lose who they were. That enduring legacy, that unbreakable core, still lingers in the wind, across the plains, the forests, and the deserts they once called home. Their fight ended, but their story, that's forever.